Hi everyone. Welcome to our first event for Current Conversations. I'm Teresa Lagerman, Community and Events Manager at the Highlands Current. We are very excited to launch this new online event series where we'll feature someone from the news every week to discuss the topic that's on everyone's mind. Clearly COVID-19 is on everyone's mind right now, so we're very fortunate to have our guest tonight, Dr. David Esteban, who's a professor of biology at Vassar College. He spoke to our reporter Jeff Sims, who is also joining us tonight, about COVID-19 a couple of weeks ago. So we're continuing this conversation tonight. It's an open conversation. We want to hear your questions. You can send them through the Q&A button that's along the bottom of your screen. I see many of you have already found it, so that's great. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. So yeah, just if you can take a second just to find that Q&A button along the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to David and Jeff so we can get started.
Thank you, Teresa. Dr. Esteban, thank you for joining us again. How are you tonight, sir?
I'm well, thanks.
As Teresa said, we'll just go ahead and get started. I did a 5 questions interview with you in the newspaper last month. If anyone didn't see that, could you just give us a quick summary of what we talked about there?
Yeah, so I guess we talked a little bit about some of the basics of coronavirus, how viruses work, which I could, we can talk more about that here. Let's see, we talked about what to expect maybe, or over the next 6 months or so, what's the course of the pandemic going to be like, and how is it going to affect us? Which I believe my answer was, I don't know. And so much of it depends on things like, will enough testing be available? How much is social distancing going to affect the course? And I think we know a little bit better now. It's really, I think it's been working, but I still find it difficult to predict where we're going to be, end of summer or fall.
Okay. I had a couple of follow-up questions from the interview, but before I go into those, really just in case anyone's listening who didn't read the interview in the paper, it might be worth going back over just very quickly.
Sure.
I think one of the questions I asked you there was, what is a coronavirus? I know there's more than one kind, and what makes this one so particularly dangerous? Maybe just a quick refresher on something like that.
Sure. So coronaviruses, there's several coronaviruses that can infect humans. This particular one is called SARS coronavirus 2 because it's so similar to the SARS virus, which appeared in the early 2000s and disappeared fairly quickly. There's another one called MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, that causes even more severe disease, but doesn't transmit well human to human. So it's had very limited numbers. And there's 4 other coronaviruses that cause more cold-like symptoms that sort of circulate, are already circulating in the human population. The reason they're called coronaviruses is that if you look at them under the electron microscope, the virus itself has this layer around it that has these large spikes, and it actually kind of looks like a crown like structure. So that's where the name comes from. And they're viruses that have a genome made of RNA, which, when we think of our genetic material, it's we think of DNA. Some viruses like corona, use RNA, which is a very similar molecule, but has some slight chemical differences as their genetic material. And that, because of that, it actually imparts a lot of unique properties that organisms that use DNA as their genetic material don't have. In terms of their infection, sort of how the infection works, all viruses actually follow a very general plan that's the same regardless of the kind of virus. They all have to be able to infect a cell to be able to replicate. And the basic steps of that replication cycle are the same for all viruses, but the details of how they actually do that is different from virus to virus. And so, you know, these coronaviruses, even though there's some important differences between them, there's slight, because of their genome and their overall structure, they're grouped together because of their similarities.
Okay. So you may have read my mind then, because the follow-up I had, you know, you led right into it nicely. I wanted to ask, what's happened internally in the human body when a virus, you know, invades the body? What kind of reaction does the body have? And then I wanted to trace that out a little further. Walk me through a couple of different scenarios. What's happening when the body overpowers or eradicates a virus, and then what needs to happen in the converse when a virus takes the advantage over the body?
Yeah. So
I mean any generic virus, you know.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, because for a lot of it, we actually don't know with this specific virus. But so in general, so as I said, you know, a virus has to be able to infect a cell to replicate, and the reason is that it doesn't have any of its own machinery to replicate. It has the genetic material, but it doesn't have the machinery that a cell has to replicate genetic material, to make new components of the virus. So the virus actually has, so the first thing is it has to find a cell that it can infect, right? And so that's breathing it in, and it'll attach to cells in the back of your throat or in your lungs, and then it gets inside the cell. And there it starts to basically take over the inner workings of the cell to basically take the processes that normally occur and use them to its own advantage, to make new virus particles. And as it does that, it can start to assemble new virus particles, which then are going to be released from the infected cell, and then those are going to infect the neighboring cells and maybe spread to other tissues in the body. That whole process, the cell doesn't just kind of sit there and accept, that this is happening. An infected cell itself has the ability to fight back against a viral infection. But in the event that it doesn't, and the virus starts to spread to other cells, then the immune system starts to kick in. But that takes longer. So there's sort of the first phase is inflammation, a very non-specific response to an infection. But then over a period of about a week, a very specific immune response will develop that's very targeted to that virus. And if the host, we call the cell or the person or animal that's infected is called a host in this case. We're not a willing host, but if if the host immune system and the cellular response is enough to get it under control and to stop it, then that's when we recover. If the immune system either fails to control the viral replication, or in some cases the immune system is mounts a disproportionate damaging response, where it actually damages damages the lungs, damages host tissues, that can also be lead to death or more severe disease. And I think what we're seeing with COVID is it's not so much the virus, it's the immune response to it. There's an out of control, a very uncoordinated immune response that seems to be driving a lot of the disease. And then, of course, from the perspective of the virus, the key thing is it has to be able to get from one infected person to the next, right? So that's then the next step is how is it going to get out of someone's body into the next host.
So do I understand correctly that it almost sounds like the body is being tricked somehow into responding more so than it needs to? It almost sounds like you're saying.
Well,
with that overload of the immune response.
Yeah. So I don't know that tricked is the right word, because that would almost certainly it's not mounting the response that it should. It's out of control. It seems to be out of control. I've heard it described as a confused or uncoordinated immune response, but we don't really know why that's happening, and it happens in some individuals and not others. So is there, are there genetic predispositions or underlying diseases, right? We know, for example, diabetes and heart disease and some other conditions are important underlying the severe cases of COVID. So it's a host problem, I think, that's leading to this severe disease, and that's actually not uncommon. There's a lot of the symptoms when we experience, the flu or a cold or other diseases. A lot of those symptoms are actually our immune system working against the virus. A fever, we turn up our body temperature because the virus doesn't replicate as well at a higher temperature. So it's uncomfortable, but it's helping. Inflammation can cause some damage, but if it kills off the virus, that's good. You can recover from that damage. But if it's too much, then that's when it's difficult to recover.
Okay, thank you. So I've seen we've got a couple questions coming in from listeners. So let's go to the first one. It has been in the news recently that the virus has mutated. Is that possible?
Yeah. So I'll start off with it always sounds scary when they say the virus is mutating, but mutation happens all the time. It's a totally normal process. So yes, it's mutating, but that doesn't necessarily mean something scary. So I mentioned it's got an RNA genome instead of DNA. One of the features of having an RNA genome is that RNA viruses mutate a lot more quickly than DNA viruses or cells. So it's definitely mutating, and those mutations. So mutations can have any number of effects. It could be a mutation that is actually lethal to the virus. It inactivates and it can't replicate anymore. Mm-hmm. It could be a mutation that has no effect, and it's just a different genetic sequence, but it has no effect on the biology of it. Or it could be a mutation that is somehow advantageous to the virus, that allows it to perhaps spread more efficiently. And I think what we're seeing is just sort of that background. Viruses are always mutating, but we haven't seen any mutations that really seem to change the properties of the virus that's allowing it to spread more easily or cause more severe disease. It's just as, it's very likely that a mutation could, for example, make the virus transmit more easily but cause less disease. So right now, I think we're just, we're seeing that background mutation rate, but not the selection for a virus that has a different property, a different trait.
Okay. Here's another that's come in from a listener. People seem less wary of those who don't have illnesses. Is an asymptomatic spread likely? I think you touched on that a little bit in the interview we did in the newspaper.
Yeah. I think it's fairly certain there's asymptomatic spread. But I don't think we really know, how effective does, if someone is not displaying symptoms, are they less effective at spreading the virus than someone who has symptoms? Mm-hmm. It seems like it's even an asymptomatic person can spread the virus, but I wouldn't be surprised to find that someone who is symptomatic could spread it more. So if you think about the way that it's likely to spread is through coughing and sneezing, right? So we're releasing all of these droplets when we cough and sneeze that contain the virus in those droplets. If you're not coughing and sneezing, somehow the virus is still, we're still able to spread it. Perhaps the tiny droplets that we release just from speaking or breathing may be enough, but exposure may be greater or more likely if you're exposed to a cough or sneeze. But definitely there's plenty of evidence for asymptomatic spread. Okay.
Yeah. Another one from a listener. Officials in Dutchess and Putnam County are calling for reopening in the immediate future. The listener is asking your opinion. Do you think that's wise?
I guess it depends on how immediate how they're defining immediate. No, I don't think it's wise if it's really immediate. Mm-hmm. Keeping in mind, my expertise is more in the biology of viruses and less in the sort of public health sure. Kind of questions. But I think it's still, cases are still pretty high in New York City. We're not that far, and there's still many cases in Dutchess and Hudson Valley region. So I think it's too early to open, but hopefully it won't be terribly long. And again, I'm hesitant to put any kind of numbers on it, but mm-hmm. At some point we're going to be able to get back out in low numbers. Where there's still going to be the need for social distancing. There's still going to be the need to keep numbers of groups low. It's not just going to go from we're all inside to everything's back to normal. Right. That gradual transition, I think, is going to be important. And having good testing, having access to good testing so that when we identify someone who is infected, that they can be identified quickly, quarantined, and do the contact tracing to figure out who they've been in touch with and try to control the spread that way. More of a surgical approach rather than a really big, everybody into quarantine.
But you may have then answered this next question, but I'm going to go ahead and read it anyway, just in case you want to expand on any more. The listener is asking, why is testing so key? What will scientists learn from mass testing that they do not know already?
Yeah. So when we can, when you can test everyone who is a possible case and their contacts, especially because of this issue of asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic spread, you can isolate people before they really have much of a chance to spread the virus. So if we're only testing people that are very sick, going into the hospital already, chances are they've already spread it to a number of people. If we can get tested when you think you've got symptoms, but they're not very, very severe yet, you get tested, you find out you're positive, and you can isolate yourself and prevent that and block that chain of transmission. But if we're not identifying those asymptomatic or those mild cases, it's going to be very, very difficult to control.
Okay. At the other end of the spectrum, then, after one's infection, another question is coming in saying, do we develop immunity, short or long-term immunity, for people who have had COVID and presumably recovered?
I think that's one of the most important questions that we need to figure out, and that we still don't have a good answer to. So in most cases, you do develop immunity to subsequent infection, but not always. There's some viruses that you don't develop good immunity to, and there's maybe immunity only lasts a year or 2 years instead of 10 years or a lifetime, and we don't know. And it's so important because you've probably heard a lot about serological testing, right? Testing for antibodies, and that's one of the major ways that our immune system fights against viral infection is with antibodies. So the question is, if we have antibodies, do those antibodies actually work to protect us? And if we don't know, the assumption has kind of been that, we've got antibodies that might mean we can go back out and we'll be safe from infection again, but we don't know that for sure yet. And there are cases of people recovering, they test negative, and then they test positive again, and they're sick again. Is it that they got reinfected and they never developed immunity, or that the symptoms just got better and were unlucky to get a false negative result in their test, and they actually never really fully recovered? That's so important to figure out, because I think I think for controlling it and for being able to go back, for people to go back out safely, we're going to need to know if immunity if those antibodies are protective.
Mm-hmm. You've talked in a couple of your answers tonight, you've talked about some things that we need to know in the future that we don't know yet. And so it seems apparent that this is kind of a long-term thing, that we're not going to figure this out overnight. Yet in the news this past week, I saw a handful of stories about vaccine, your progress made on vaccines in different places,
Yeah.
and kind of the rush job of trying to squeeze what's normally maybe a 24-month process, or perhaps even longer. You're trying to squeeze that as tight as possible so that these things can be rushed out. So I guess is it possible to bump something up like that so quickly, you know, when we're in a crisis like this, to really squeeze a schedule like that?
Yeah. So first, let me say, yeah, you're right. There's a lot we don't know, but it's amazing how much we've learned in such a short amount of time. You know, if you know, I'm trying to keep up to some degree with the scientific literature on this, and it's at this point it's impossible to read everything. You know, there are papers coming out at such an incredible pace. You know, there's so much research going on about it, and there's so much that isn't, you know, hitting the scientific literature yet, right? We're really seeing scientific research being done, you know, reported on Facebook and Twitter and the news cycle, and right, the pace is incredible. So we are learning a lot, and we are, you know, answering a lot of important questions. As to your question about vaccines, so you know, the optimistic timeline, I think, is you know, a vaccine, you know, within a year or so at this point. I think it's optimistic, but it's possible. You know, a lot of the some of what makes the process slow is the bureaucracy of the whole process, of all the sort of checks and balances, that the reviews that are important, but that in an emergency can be accelerated. The FDA, that may normally only meet at certain times, can meet, you know, in response to immediate needs, and so on. So it can certainly be accelerated. What can't be accelerated is the process of carrying out a good clinical trial. You know, manufacturing enough vaccine to test, to wait for results from that. You know, is it safe? Are there any reactions? Is it protective? You know, that's going to take time to figure out, and you can't rush it. And then if we find something that does work in a clinical trial, you know, the next challenge is the manufacture and the distribution, and that's going to take time too. But you know, I think all of those logistics can be done in a more rapid time frame than normal. But that all depends on finding one that works. And right now, I think there's 4 vaccines, 6 vaccines being tested in humans in phase 2 trials, which is sort of the large, you know, medium size trial. Several of those are in China. One of them is in the UK. So if any of those show promise, then that's great. But they could fail, right? They could fail in a phase 2 trial, and then we have to go back to one that's at an earlier stage.
Okay. I know, Teresa, we were getting close to 7:30. That was kind of our marker for when we were going to close this. You let me know how long we'll go. I see we have a few more questions coming in from listeners. I'm going to try to go through these kind of rapid fire.
I'll try to be more succinct in my answers.
No worries.
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple more. Yeah.
Okay, great. A listener asked, did the pandemic surprise you as a biologist, or do biologists just think it's a matter of time before something like this happens?
Well, I guess actually my answer to that is yes to both. It surprised me because I remember doing a panel on this, when it was still basically contained in China, a few cases, I think, in South Korea at the time. And I did not appreciate that this could happen. I thought back to SARS, which did spread to multiple countries, but it was contained relatively easily. And so I kind of thought that was what was going to happen. So I was not particularly concerned. So that did catch me by surprise. But it also doesn't surprise me that a virus can do this, that it can spread so quickly around the world, because it's happened before with many other viruses. And with the interconnectedness of the world, with the way that we're spreading into undeveloped areas and getting exposed to new viruses, it really was a matter of time before something like this would happen.
Okay, and I think this is the last one we'll do. This question I mentioned to you earlier. My 8-year-old son submitted this question to me, but I'm going to ask it because I really think a lot of people are asking very similar questions. What he said to me is, are we going to be able to play with our friends this summer? And before you start, though, I'll add a little bit to that, because in the interview in the newspaper, the last thing you said was that you felt there was a chance that we could have a round two, a potentially dangerous round two of this, if social distancing guidelines were lifted too early. Yeah. So while everyone from 8 years old to 80 is probably thinking, are we going to be able to get out and play with our friends and live a semi-normal life this summer? What's your take as far as your fears of a round two coming in the fall if we do too much too soon?
Yeah, I think there will be a round two, no matter what we do, whether it's worse or similar or less severe. I think really depends on how, on what we do. This virus is going to be with us. It's not just going to go away, over the summer and we all go back to the fall and everything's back to normal. It's still going to be around. It's still going to be spreading so I think no matter, how many cases and how quickly they come, I think really depends on how well we do the next phase, which is going to be, maintaining social distancing, good tracking and contact tracing and good testing, so that it's not a lockdown, but rather that more precise epidemiological tracking. But I think we all have to be prepared for, at some point, some people are going to have to be quarantined and that we may have to say for the next little while, restaurants are closed again, bars are closed again, but other businesses where there might be less, smaller crowds. So I think I think it's gonna be with us. We just have to do it smartly.
Okay.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I can't answer your son's question. I wish I could. It kind of breaks my heart to hear a question like that, because it's going to be so hard for kids to, well, for all of us, but I think, for kids to not be able to play with their friends in the summer. But maybe, when we can be out in small groups again, right? Then, you know, playing with a friend would be the kind, you know, that can be a small group activity, but maybe not, you know, a birthday party with 25 people.
Well, I thought I remembered you mentioning that you had kids of your own, and so I felt comfortable asking you that because I bet you've already heard it before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Although I can say I think my kids are pretty happy not to be in school.
Yeah. Okay, we're at 7:34, Teresa. I will hand it back over to you.
We are out of time, but thank you so much for taking the time to answer all these questions. We weren't able to get through all of them, but I think we covered a lot. Thank you so much, David and Jeff and everyone else for joining. We hope you enjoyed this first current conversation, and keep an eye out for the next one in the next week or two. And yeah, we'll do it again soon. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight.
My pleasure.
Okay.